table. T.R. Carr and Amy Hunter are still here. Joining us now is Dave Leipold's Community-Based Study Director, Better Together, STL. Well, let's just jump right in from what the chief was saying. Are you buying what he's saying? He just said, I believe 20 municipalities, ballpark, in 5 years could be out of business if they aren't able to collect revenue the way the DOJ describes.
I think it's quite possible. In looking at the St. Louis County region, we found 21 municipalities that got 20% or more of their budget from fines and fees. And when it's that significant a portion of your budget, it's going to be hard to make adjustments at that point. And some decisions that could have been made maybe 10, 20, 30 years ago and adjustments could have been made are kind of out of reach now. So it is very much a possibility.
A couple of things on that. One, the report said that it's not just that they get their money this way, but that they're budgeting that they'll get more the next year as well, $1 million more the next year.
Well, one of the issues that we face in St. Louis County is how do we adequately fund municipal governments? We have 90 municipalities in St. Louis County. Most of these were organized prior to 1950. So they were organized at a time when the economy was different, and these municipalities did have the ability to provide services. What we're finding now is that as wealth has moved farther west, as retail, as manufacturing has moved farther west, these municipalities no longer have the ability to provide services. And so the real issue is some of these municipalities have chosen to rely, unfortunately, upon law enforcement as a significant source of revenue. So Max Creek, if the state legislature does amend it, reduce the proportion of revenue that cities can keep, it'll have a profound impact.
Max Creek is a law that says 30% is the most of your budget that can come from traffic fines, which can be defined differently in different places, but they're talking about reducing it to, I think, 10%.
Yeah, I'd like to offer that we could imagine living in a community where police actually protect and serve and don't stop people so that we can generate revenue. I mean, I think that's the kind of world that we'd actually like to see. And so when we're talking about closing down municipalities, we're actually really having a conversation about how we change policing, right? And so policing is protecting and serving, not pulling people over to collect fines and fees. I mean, that is the kind of universe and world we're trying to live in, right? Because that is the world that some of us live in right now. So in some places, some people don't get pulled over because of their skin tone, and they're not being ticketed, fined, harassed because of their race.
Well, and in some places they don't get pulled over as much, period, regardless of if you go across the river, according to a recent report in the Post-Dispatch, municipalities don't get the kind of money that you do on this side of the river from traffic fines, and police in Madison County, St. Clair County don't write as many tickets.
Wouldn't that be nice?
Sticking with the theme of data here that we've been talking about.
And I'd like to say something about the focus. Like we're talking about the economic impact, and Senator Schmidt's bill would reduce the cap from 30% to 10% on traffic-related tickets. So two things. One, it doesn't do anything about non-traffic tickets, right? It doesn't take a genius to figure out that the second we say you have to cap your revenue on traffic tickets, somebody's going to say, that $25 fee that we charge when you violate your ordinance for housing is now a $250 fee. And that'll hurt the poor people who are living in those communities even more than these tickets. The other thing is, I want to go back to something Chief Fitch said, and he's been very forthright about the fact that he sees this policing as an abuse of police power. But I find it problematic that in every interview I've ever seen him talk in, he says, this isn't the police's fault, it's the government's fault. Well, it's both people's fault, right? Like, if we live in a country where you can disobey an unlawful order. We live in a country where your continued employment is not as important as following the law. So if you're faced with being fired because you don't racially profile, and because you don't meet a quota system, and because you refuse to impose unlawful fees on people, so be it. Leave the job, right? And I think until we have a conversation where that discussion is added to it, that it's a police's responsibility not to participate in this, not just to say after the fact, it's the governmental agency telling me I should or should not do this, but rather I as a police officer am sworn to enforce the law, and this isn't what I signed up to do. I didn't sign up to be a ticket writer. I signed up to be a police officer. In a perfect world, I imagine police officers went to the academy to help communities, not to destroy them.
And I think that it's really part of a larger discussion about how we operate as a region as well. The two most politically expedient ways to raise revenue and stay in power and continue to run a government is to go after sales tax or go after fines. Because why? People who vote for you don't necessarily get affected by those as disproportionately. If you ask for a property tax increase, your odds of getting reelected may be a little bit lower. So I think that we all need to take a look at why there's a need to treat people the way that we do in this region with our municipal court system. And it's a hunger for 90 municipalities, a city and a county. Everybody's kind of competing against each other, whether it's for retail, whether it's for fines. Everybody needs that revenue to survive because the system itself is flawed. There's systemic issues across our region.
Of course, they also say they get to know their mayor and they get their street cleaned when they call their mayor and they get their snow removed. There are a lot of people, even in north central St. Louis County, who don't want to let go of Felda Village or Uplands Park.
One thing to keep in mind is that all of these municipalities were created by the citizens. They're incorporations, so the public did vote to create them, and the public has the right to vote to disincorporate. So it's one thing for us to say there are too many municipalities. It's another thing to recognize that the power for disincorporation rests with the residents of each individual municipality. If they choose to disincorporate, they can. But regardless, the real issue is how do we fund services? The reason, and I'm not defending the municipalities at all, but one of the reasons they do write these tickets is to provide revenue for our streets, parks, other kinds of municipal services. So the underlying issue, I think you were correct, deals with how do we fund municipal government. Right now we have 61 municipal police departments in St. Louis County. That's a lot of police departments, and there's a certain inherent inefficiency. But at the same time, that's because the public wants them. Because they believe, the public argues that they have a higher degree of accountability if they have their own small municipal department. That's subject to debate.
I can't tell if Amy's shaking her head yes or no.
No, go ahead, let Thomas
No,
speak.
you go ahead. Go ahead.
I mean, I think at some point we are going to have to talk about, as a region, why we are separated like this and the ways that we are separated, and then move to a place where we are really trying to be neighbors with one another. I think at some point we're going to have to talk about racial covenants and why our suburbs were created, and it really wasn't so that we could be closer together as individuals and we could live in integrated communities, because we don't. And so at some point we're going to have that conversation, and then how it impacts our educational system, not to mention our police, right? So we're having this conversation about police, but that same policing practice happens in our schools as well, and it's disparate treatment again. So if we looked at suspension and expulsion rates, they look a lot like our police on the ground. And so, we're going to have to start having real conversations really about race, and then how we could be a region that is healthy, that is clear, that is committed to being a better region, which is incredibly possible, but we have to have honest dialogue about where we're going next.
Yeah, and I think that's what we hear from people as well, too. The Cardinals are in the World Series, everybody's from St. Louis. A shooting happens in Ferguson, and all of a sudden everybody's from the city, from Webster, from Kirkwood. And as a community, you live with each other through everything. And as a region, that's how you survive and how you thrive. And when you see strong regions in other places really growing, it's because they have that connectedness across their economy, across their communities.
One thing to keep in mind is that the reason the city of St. Louis is not in St. Louis County is back in 1876, the city wanted to avoid the problems of funding the financial burdens associated with a rural county, and so they withdrew. Those boundary lines were drawn, and we're still living with the effects of that. At the same time, a lot of municipalities were created specifically to provide services, specifically to maintain quality of life issues. And if you look at the last municipality incorporations that occurred in the late 1990s, again, they were drawn for a specific reason. So we have to look at our region and decide, what does the public really want, and how can we move this region forward within the context of the situation, the social, economic climate that we have.
I just want to say, we can't, when we talk about what the public wants, and when these towns were formed in 1950s, the public meant a very different thing than it means now. So when these towns were formed, it wasn't based on the vote of African Americans in our community. It was based on the vote of white folks who wanted to escape being around black folks. And that's the history of those towns. And we can't ignore that when we talk about this. Some of the very reasons where people want to have their own town is to exclude others from being in it. And as those folks moved even further west and out into the further west suburbs, what we see is the vestiges of an apartheid-like structure that continues to infect our region, and that has to be removed.
I got to believe there are very few people in West St. Louis County or St. Charles County that believe they have anything to do with anything apartheid-like.
I'm sure they don't, but that's because they don't come into North County very often. That's because they left it. But the fact is, when I've been to the Southern Center for Human Rights and the Southern Poverty Law Center, they spent their entire careers fighting the KKK, put them out of business in Alabama. And when I told them about the municipal court structure, this was in 2010 when we just got started, they said, that's worse than what we see in Alabama. Southern Center for Human Rights said, that's worse than what we've ever seen in Georgia. So Missouri has the distinction of being worse than Alabama and Georgia in terms of how we treat the poor and African Americans in our region. And the New York Times talked to me, the first time I ever said this, to talk to them about this structure, they said, you've just described apartheid to me. So it's not Thomas Harvey who says this is apartheid. This is a feedback we get once we get out of our regional bubble and describe in a vacuum what we're talking about and what has come into place in our region. We may not like that term, and I get it. It's got a very serious connotation. But when you talk about the way this structure works and the people it impacts and the people it destroys, it kind of looks like it.
I would agree with you with much of what you say. It's important for us to keep in mind that the individuals that have the power in these small municipalities are African American, they're minority communities, and they have the right, should they so desire, to disincorporate. One of the issues we have is if we have, I'll pick a number, say we have 24 municipalities, African American, 24 African American mayors, 200 African American city council members. We'd like minority participation in the political process. If they consolidate, we have one mayor, we have 10 council members. Have we increased or have we decreased minority participation in the political process? That's a question. I do not have the answer for it, but that's an issue that we have to grapple with.
Hold on one second. We got gremlins in your microphone, so I don't want to cut off this excellent conversation, but let's take a look at social media, get some more input from that, fix the gremlins.